Welcome to Beyond Fight or Flight, a series from the Center for Healthy Churches. If you have people, you have differences. And sometimes those differences create tension. Our hope is to help you build a safer space for hard conversations, moving from reaction to discernment, from anxiety to grounded presence, and from division to trust building. Wherever your church is right now, we're here to help you take the next faithful step. Let's get started.
Well, it's morning where I am, so I'll say good morning to you wherever you are. I'm Joel Snyder. I'm one of the consultants with the Center for Healthy Churches. I work across our different lines of service, but I have particular responsibility with our conflict and identity team. And I'm joined today by three of my colleagues as we address the idea of what is a faithful arc of activities, ways of addressing conflict that a church leader might take if it appears in their congregation. So, Matt Cook, tell us just a little bit about yourself.
So, as Joel said, I'm Matt Cook. I'm the director of the center, and I also work on the conflict and identity team. So I'm given the interesting privilege of walking alongside congregations in challenging moments. I reside in Dallas, Texas. I've been with the center for 6 years now, for 3 years as assistant director, and then for the last 3 years as director. And one kind of sub-specialization within the conflict work that we do and the identity work that we do is I have particular interest in a practice that focuses on helping congregations work through questions of political polarization. So, and I think, David, you're next up. So, David, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Matt. David Brubaker. I live just outside of Harrisonburg, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley of Northwest Virginia. I have been with CHC for about 2 years now, but have consulted privately and with other organizations for many years prior to that. In terms of the work that I do, anything related to change and conflict in congregations, that includes visioning processes or strategic planning, and also dealing with structure review requests these days is more common. I think, Ed, you're next.
Yes, thanks, David. I'm Ed McLeod. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I served my last church. I'm a retired Presbyterian pastor. I have been with CHC for about a minute. I'm brand new, mostly because after a long pastorate, I wasn't ready to go back into full-time work, but I was hoping to serve some purpose in local churches. I haven't had any assignments yet, but more than likely I will gravitate toward churches in transition, but also churches who are experiencing some conflict.
Well, and Ed, you mentioned your life as a Presbyterian. I'll just add, Matt and I are native Baptist, although my wife and I now attend an Episcopal church, and David is out of the Mennonite tradition. So this is a good representation of the backgrounds we have in CHC. Well, Matt, let's get on with it, and I'll ask you the first question. What do you see as a common barrier to a church leader, a pastor in particular? What stops them from addressing conflict when they see it in their church?
There's a couple of things that I thought of. So you're going to hear kind of throughout this series us reference the work of a man by the name of Speed Lee, right? Who kind of has this framework for kind of understanding conflict, and he talks about the kind of the 5 levels of disagreement and conflict in a congregation. But there's actually a level below level 1, and it's level 0. And level 0, I want to kind of point to a little bit, is there's no disagreement, or at least no willingness to acknowledge disagreement within the system in some way. So I won't say that this is the only answer. I'll speak out of my own experience as a pastor who served Baptist congregations in the South for decades. One of the things that I saw all the time was kind of a passive-aggressive approach to conflict, and literally an unwillingness to name on a systemic level that there actually are disagreements, to kind of get them out there in the open. So you handle them off to the side, and sometimes you handle them in ways that could be unhealthy. And what often happened is like that unwillingness to name disagreement and to talk through it was like trying to hold down the lid on a tea kettle, right? And if you do it long enough, before long, the pressure is going to build and it's just going to kind of explode outward, often straight from not even acknowledging that there is disagreement all the way up sometimes to unhealthy levels of disagreement, straight into kind of toxic levels of conflict. And so I think that's one. The other one, and I'll name this again from my own experience, is sometimes I don't think pastors recognize the extent to which we are unintentional or maybe even intentional contributors to disagreement and conflict. So we're not as fully aware of the power differentials and systems. And so we'll come in with the best of intentions, not necessarily recognizing the ways that we are introducing change into a system without calculating the change costs in advance. And so I think one of the things that often happens in terms of a barrier to addressing conflict on that side of things is the pastor is not recognizing the power and the privilege they have within the system in some ways. And that's often a barrier to conflict as well.
It does seem like a lot of pastors are conflict adverse.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, David, let me ask you, I know you've worked in a number of congregations, and everybody thinks their church is unique, but surely there are a few patterns, a few steps that almost any church leader, any pastor could take once they recognize that tensions have risen to the level where they need to address it.
Yeah, I would identify 3 consistently helpful steps that a congregation could take. And the first relates to Matt's comments about level 0, and that is to invite disagreement. If you're in a leadership role, make it safe for people to disagree with you. When I was a professor or even as a dean, I wanted people to come to me directly and let me know when they disagreed with something that I was doing, because that's far healthier than going to somebody else and complaining about it and then coming indirectly back to me. So I would let people know, this is what I'm thinking, and I welcome your response to that. Whether you agree or disagree, I welcome that. Make it safe to disagree. And secondly, as a congregation, think about drafting a congregational covenant, a covenant that talks about how we're going to relate to each other when things are going well and when things are tense. We've helped many congregations to draft such documents, and the best time to do it is when things are calm. And we're thinking about how do we want to relate to each other in this period and going forward, particularly in an era of polarization. It's really helpful to lay out those values that will inform our behavior towards each other. And third, for every person who claims to follow Jesus, follow Matthew 18. There's a very clear process for when you have aught against your brother or sister, or your sister or brother has aught against you. It basically involves going directly to the other person and having a conversation. And I think to keep that in the spirit of 1 Peter 3:15, always be prepared to give an answer to those who ask you for the reason for the hope that is within you, but do that with gentleness and respect. So the way that we do it really matters.
Yeah, that's thank you. That's very, very strong. And it's interesting to me that when we get called in, a lot of people want to look at bylaws and structures and think if they could fix that, but it's those relational concerns that really seem to be the most important and the most vital to a church's life. Well, Ed, you had a long career as a pastor. In your experience, what have you found to be important steps that you think other pastors could take when things get tense?
Probably my first thing is just to take a breath and to slow down, to resist the temptation. Very likely, if there's a conflict going on, you as a pastor will have an opinion about which side is on the side of the angels. But I do think it's important to resist the temptation to be co-opted by one of those sides and perhaps even demonize the other side. I mean, that's what's going on anyway. And so I do think it's important we've all heard the expression to be a non-anxious presence. I've said this in other places. One of my gurus says the best you can hope for is to be a less anxious presence in the middle of conflict, to show that maybe that can bring the temperature down a little bit. But another one of my teachers made this very obvious point, is that on Sunday morning, your congregation gives you an uninterrupted hearing for 20 minutes. That means that for the rest of the week, you need to be a listener, that you need to hear what's going on, give folks an uninterrupted time to say what they think, why they think it. And another thing this same guru tells me is, you might, as a pastor, find yourself sometimes on the losing side of a vote at a session meeting or a deacon meeting, and learning how to model losing an argument with grace helps plant the seed that everything is not a do or die situation, that sometimes you're going to be on the side that prevails, sometimes you're going to be on the side that doesn't prevail, but then we just move on to the next item on the agenda. That we don't have to turn everything into thermonuclear war. It's also important, I think, to remember that debatable matters have been a part of church life ever since Paul established churches. But that's the point. They're debatable. And just because I think I'm right about something doesn't mean I'm right. And that's why I'm in a community of people who may have different opinions, so that we may perhaps grow and learn together. Years ago, I was influenced by Jonathan Sacks, and I won't remember which book he says this, but he wanted to call folks to what he called the best of the rabbinic tradition. He said when two rabbis would argue, they would not argue to try to defeat the other and to come out victorious in the argument. They would argue because they both had a sense that they had something of the truth. And if they argued faithfully together, they might move closer to the truth. And I've always found that a very hopeful and helpful bit of advice, that we go into this not to try to conquer the person who disagrees with us, but because we're part of the same church family, we are trying to get closer and closer to the best vision we can have for this particular body of Christ. And that's a hopeful way of moving through disagreements or conflicts to me.
Well, that's very, very sage advice, a challenge. Well, when I listen to you all, and I'll have to say that one of the reasons I enjoy working with CHC is because I get to interact with a lot of really wise people. You've heard each other answer questions. Do you have any things you'd want to piggyback or respond to what one of your other colleagues has said?
David, back in episode 1, said something that I think is really, really important. David talked about the fact that if we don't deal with things when they're at the lower level of disagreement, we can expect to be dealing with them in a much more difficult manner at the higher level of disagreement. So an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, so to speak, right? That when we can find a way, when disagreement first begins to kind of display itself, and I think in ways that Ed talked about too, in which we are approaching the question not from the perspective of who's going to win the argument, but how can we collectively together pursue God's will together, the more effective formation of our mission, carrying out of our mission together, and let something emerge that's bigger than any one person's perspective. I cannot overstate that enough. If you are a congregational leader that finds yourself kind of in the early stages there, right? Like camping out in that and not being afraid of it and not postponing it and kicking the can down the road, but instead of recognizing there's something here that we need to sit with and surface and talk about for a while, maybe patiently, carefully, but still we need to talk about for a while, is one of the single best things, not just for resolving conflict, but also even for carrying out your mission as a congregation, because there's usually something beneath that your church needs to take a look at.
Well, I'll tell you, Matt, I'm reminded of a deacon in a church where I was interim pastor. and he said, bad news never ages well. And conflict usually doesn't age well either. It's better to be addressed up front. Ed, David, what do you have?
I wonder if there's kind of a, because I completely agree with that. I think the danger, the other danger is trying to resolve it too quickly, to try to silence some voices artificially. And so, I'm sure there's no but the sweet spot of addressing it. John Wooden, as a basketball coach at UCLA, used to say, be quick, but don't hurry. And I think there may be some wisdom there.
That's great.
We're talking about processes in this conversation. And one thing I've learned about congregational processes is we have to go slow in order to go fast. So it's really, I think what Matt was addressing, what you just talked about, Ed, was as we're planning a process towards decision making, making sure that there's substantial listening built into that process. Because when people feel that we've listened to them, they give us the right to make change. And if people feel that they haven't been heard, they don't give us that right.
One of our other colleagues, Bill Wilson, always says slow is fast.
Yeah.
You go slow, and it really winds up getting you there more quickly. Well, Matt, in another question, you mentioned polarization. About a year or so ago, under your leadership, CHC developed a resource called R12 that addresses trying to deal with political polarization in a congregation. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this episode we're trying to kind of surface frameworks and patterns and pathways. So let me talk about kind of the pattern and the pathway that exists within R12. R12 stands for Romans 12. There's a lot of good wisdom in Scripture, particularly in the New Testament, for how to address conflict. Romans 12 is one of those kind of golden chapters, I think, that contains a lot of wisdom. And if you follow kind of Paul's wisdom, I think you'll see this borne out within social science as well, that there is kind of a pathway through how you deal with issues that really are very, very divisive. So that letter was written to a context in which Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians were significantly struggling to get along, and there was power differentials there. And so Paul is writing, in essence, to ask these house churches to be in relationship with one another despite these political differences, not political in the way that we think of Democrats and Republicans, but still political in the sense that a community of people had vested interest in the way that things were being done. And so the framework that we kind of point to is that it starts, actually, it precedes us. If you're going to resolve the conflict, you have to recognize we are joining conflict resolution that is already taking place. In other words, God started the work of reconciliation long before the moment, and we're just joining in work that already has a model, and that model is given to us by God through Jesus Christ. And so that model is a sacrificial model. That model is a model of mercy. It's a model of love. It's not a model of force, but it's a model of being willing to sacrifice ourselves first. And so we begin actually acknowledging that there is a vital center at the middle of our congregation, and that vital center is God. That it's even bigger than things that we think are really, really important, whatever that thing might be, whether that's a worship style question or in the questions of political polarization, kind of where we land on a left-right spectrum. If we recognize that God is bigger than all of us, then that gives us a place to start. And if we start there, kind of the natural byproduct of that is also starting to recognize if there is a God, the other things that we often try to elevate to that level can quickly become idols. So we have given politics a place that it is really not supposed to have. It's not to say it's not important, but there are a lot of things in creation that are significant and important that don't rise to that highest level, that allegiance that we should give to God alone. And so I would name that idolization is an issue. So you move from starting with putting our focus on God in worship to humility is the kind of the next step that emerges out of that, recognizing that there is a God, it's not us. Out of that, we move to a step of recognizing that we take this journey alongside others and we need to understand where they're coming from. So the next step on that journey is empathy. I said in an earlier episode, I think empathy is on trial right now, and I think it's deeply embedded in the New Testament. Paul says, mourn with those who mourn and rejoice with those who rejoice, including and perhaps especially with those that we disagree with politically. And if we can do that, then it de-escalates the differences that we have and gives us an opportunity to listen to one another. We move beyond empathy to blessing, actually actively seeking the good and contributing to the good of those that we disagree with. And then finally, it moves beyond kind of how we deal with things interpersonally to how the community deals with it. Moves into a fifth stage, which is unity rather than uniformity. So a lot of congregations want to settle the issue, and then they want to push out everybody that doesn't agree, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And the New Testament actually makes a fair amount of space for disagreement to coexist within congregations. And then lastly, the last part of that framework is with a really sexy title. We talk about proactive structures. So much of the way that we think about these issues is through the lens of our individualism, what I think, what you think. But if we aren't in congregations, aren't finding ways to kind of put concrete things in place that hold us together, then some of the natural forces at work in the cultural right now are centrifugal forces that are kind of send us out towards the edge. So congregations have to build into their systems things that kind of hold people together and lovingly, gently hold them accountable. So I've unloaded a lot for you if you're a pastor or a congregational leader, but that kind of movement from starting with God all the way out through self-examination, out towards our interpersonal relationships, into communal relationships, I think is a way for us to kind of deal with the questions of polarization.
You know, someone used a musical analogy in my presence that unison is pretty, but harmony is richer. And I think that might be a way to think. We each have our individual voice, but when we can sing in concert with other voices, you know, it is a richer experience. Well, so R12, I'm sure they can find some reference to that on the CHC website. Can you point them?
Yeah, so our website's www.churches.org, and then within that, there's a tab that you can go to that kind of talks about a lot of the different components to that. You know, I've described the framework, but there's actually several different resources within that. There's a congregational assessment tool. There's a leadership training module. There's a one-day retreat for your congregation, all ways to kind of think about these things and teach these things, either proactively because you're trying to get ahead of it, or even hopefully reactively in the sense that we can come alongside your church if this is an issue that's presenting itself and it's making it difficult.
So does anybody else have a resource that you would want to point out that people who leaders who find themselves in conflict might refer to, a good book or podcast?
There are a variety of organizations that have produced that kind of material. Frankly, when it comes to dealing with our polarized environment, I've reviewed the R12 material, and I think it's the most helpful resource right now for congregations for U.S.-based congregations that find themselves in this macro environment that is so polarized. Particularly, just to quote Matt, the vital center is God. To recenter our identity in God and God's revelation in Jesus Christ, I think is a critical piece, because what's really being contested is identity. And that's where this series is going to go eventually. So we'll invite people to continue to accompany these sessions. But then to have what he called proactive structures that are designed to respond to difference in healthy ways, and culture, congregational culture, that welcomes disagreement, as I talked about earlier. Because here's the paradox: when we welcome disagreement, we're less likely to have destructive conflict. When we prevent or prohibit or try to sabotage disagreement, we are more likely to see it go underground and then erupt in unhelpful ways.
And David, I know you probably wouldn't mention it yourself, but your book, When the Center Does Not Hold, is a great resource as well, I think.
Thank you.
A book that I have found helpful, and I can't remember the author, but it's "You Are What You Love," and the case is made there that we live in a world of secular liturgies that basically train us to be secular, whereas the liturgy of the church helps to frame us and shape us into people who worship and adore God and love the church. And so the challenge is the secular liturgies have our attention almost constantly, and the liturgy of the church maybe gets an hour a week. And but just to name those liturgies, to be able to let people realize they are being invited into liturgical communities when they go to the shopping mall or when they or whatever. And so I think it gives a way to talk about those things that are moving us away from the center and creating new centers that are not helpful to us as individuals or us as communities.
Yeah, let me give an amen to that. That's James K.A. Smith who wrote that. And,
yes, that's right.
And like, it's his thinking is all over R12, especially the early portions where we're talking about worship and humility. So really, really good book. I recommend it highly. One I'd add to that, I like Amanda Ripley's High Conflict, right? Like she talks a lot and really kind of examines the question and what kind of happens in us. That's not written just from a perspective of congregational conflict. It's a broader resource than that. But it was a really helpful book for me to just kind of understand like what's taking place in people and what's causing that in us individually and what to be aware of in ourselves when those moments come and find us.
I was going to say, Matt, when you talked about the importance of humility, I always remember Tony Campolo famously said, "I will discuss theology with anybody as long as they begin with the words, 'I might be wrong, but,' and then they make their case." Yeah. And that if we But that comes from a point of view of humility. I believe this deeply, but I know I might be wrong.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to add one other resource, and if you would like a book that deals with your understanding yourself internally and trying to deal with things like that, I would recommend Edwin Friedman's Failure of Nerve. I think that should be a required book for pastoring in the age we find ourselves. Well, listen, this has been a great conversation. Thank Ed, David, and Matt for joining us today. I would like to add that if you go to the CHC website, churches.org, and you look under resources and you can find our team, you can find our contact information. And if you reach out to us, send us an email, we will respond to you. We'll be glad to provide some simple advice. We'd be glad to engage with you and your congregation. We're here to serve you. Thanks for joining us today.
You and I live in the midst of the most significant season of change in the history of the American church. And disagreement almost always comes along for the ride when changes are taking place. You are going to need both a mindset and a skill set for walking through disagreement in ways that fosters light rather than heat and love rather than anger. We think that this series will help you get started. And if after listening you realize that you need more assistance than a web series can provide, then give us a call. Our mission is to help your church be healthy. We consider it a privilege to walk alongside you.